please, and we'll be arranged. Yeah.
That's all right.
Bishop, it's been broken down. It's got trust in the land. It takes so much time.
This is used for community good things.
Okay, so that's all they do. $1.5 million in the bank.
Okay, I'm going to take those that are in the room standing are actually at the table, so we're going to open the meeting, and I have the apologies. I'm happy to move those apologies.
Happy to second.
Second by Councillor Walker, Wayne Walker. So Penny Hulse, Council Business, Kathy Casey and Member Honeck for absence, and Pipery for lateness. Moved and seconded. All those in favour?
Aye.
Okay, right. Declarations of interest. Any declarations? Any confirmation of the minutes, please?
Happy to move, Mr Chair.
Sure, in a good mood today, Councillor Walker. I'll second that. All those in favour? Okay, there are no petitions, there's no public input, there's no local board input, no extraordinary business, no notice of motion, and we welcome evaluation report. We welcome Neil and Peter to the table. And Debbie, sorry, Debbie, isn't it? Yes, sorry.
That's okay.
Hey, John.
Sorry, you're at the bottom of the report, Debbie, but not at the top, so that's why I noticed. So welcome.
Thank
Debbie,
you.
you're leading off, yes?
Yeah, just as by way of introduction, good morning, councillors.
Yep.
We've got Neil Sullivan here, the Valuer General today, and he's just going to go through the process of the revaluation and what each of our obligations are in that process, and some key facts. Then we're going to hand over to Peter Mackay. He is our principal valuer, and he's going to go into more detail about the findings in this 2017 revaluation. So,
Okay.
All right, well, thanks Debbie, and thanks for the opportunity, Mayor and councillors, to come along and have a chat about the 2017 Auckland Council revaluation, which has just landed and getting a bit of media attention, as you'd expect.
Yeah, I think.
So, you know, you could say in an understatement, Kiwis are highly engaged with property and values, and
That would be an understatement.
that would be an understatement, yeah. And rating valuations sort of are way more of a number than just something to pay your rates on. They go to the sort of sense of Kiwis' equity and value, so they do treat them very seriously, and way more than anywhere else I've seen in the world, where people aren't so keen on their rating and taxing values. New Zealanders seem to be fairly enamoured with them for a number of reasons. Okay, so what I want to do today in a brief slot before Pete talks is just sort of give you a bit of information about the process and how revaluations are done, why they're done, what's the sort of legal framework. They are an obligation. They must be done once every 3 years through the legislation. There's no choice in that matter. You had to do it. And unlike some countries, the process is quite separate. The councils, while they own the valuation process, they have to conform to sort of regulatory standards. So we'll touch on that briefly as well. So hopefully at the end of this we can demystify and put a bit more clarity around what a revaluation is. So this, some of the things I'm saying Pete might repeat as well or cover off. I always believe though you've got to hear something 7 times often before you hear it for the first time, so that's the spirit we're delivering it in. We'd rather have it more than less. 550,000 properties involved in this as at 1 July 2017. So we always have a retrospective valuation date, and that simply means that all the sales evidence and market evidence that relates to the revaluation effective date can be gathered and analysed sufficiently. If we delivered the values right on 1 July, we wouldn't have the market evidence for 1 July to work with properly. So you'd need a bit of hang time to work through the numbers and find out where the market was at on that day. And because the values are used for sort of rating purposes, every property has to be valued on the same day in the same market conditions. Okay, it's the biggest revaluation in Australasia. I take great delight in telling my Valuer General colleagues in Australia that, because Brisbane City's the next biggest at about 400,000. And they always want to be biggest and best, and Auckland is the biggest. So whether that's good or bad, I'm not sure, but that's what it is. $720 billion total value, starting to get up there. Well, numbers like $1 trillion, you know, are starting to come into the radar. Residential, 70% of the overall value, so big residential portion. The rest is made up of commercial, industrial, rural and lifestyle type properties. So this slide just shows prior to 1998, all rating valuations used to be done by a central government agency known as the Valuation Department, and that was removed in 98, and a split occurred between regulation and operation. So the Valuer General became responsible for setting the standards for how valuations have to be done, and also a process of having to come along and certify that the valuation was up to standard before the council could use it for rating purposes. The Territorial Authority then became front and centre in the process. So the council owns the valuations and the whole operational process for doing the valuations. The council also owns the sort of majority of the communications and telling the story about what these valuations are and what sort of movements have occurred and keeping their ratepayer public informed. So prior to 98, that was a central government function. Post 1998, shifted to territorial authorities such as Auckland Council. Now the council will do this through engaging valuation service providers. They must use registered valuers to a certain extent to do the revaluation. So in the case of Auckland, there's an in-house Auckland valuation team, and also Quotable Value did a fair component of the revaluation as well, and they're the valuation service provider, and they have to conform with the standards that I set, but also deliver to the contract obligations of Auckland Council. And on the left-hand side is the ratepayer, who ends up receiving a notice and has various sort of rights around what they can do once they receive their notice, and we'll cover that off. But the main thing is to say that, yeah, the council is front and centre of ownership of these values now, and that's how the process works. So one of the things I just wanted to do is sort of explain the importance of the councillor's role in a revaluation, that it's really critical that you understand the sort of process and hopefully support the revaluation. As I say, rating values are a big deal for Kiwis. They're a big deal for council because they go to the basis of how you're funded, and that's where your revenue comes from year to year. And generally it's a fairly reliable system, property rates. People understand it, they can relate to what it provides and why they're paying it. We saw what happened in the UK a while ago when they tried to shift from property rates valuations to poll tax, and that was a disaster, and there was protests in Trafalgar Square and Maggie Thatcher's effigy being burnt. So, you know, when you get the system wrong, people rile up against it, but generally we've had over 100 years of sort of confidence in the property-based valuation system and rating that flows from that. So the regulatory environment that sits around it is the Rating Valuations Act, and that sets up an arrangement for a thing called the Rating Valuations Rules 2008. Some of the key bits around it are we have a thing called a rating unit, and that rating unit sort of defines the unit of tax that goes on to each council's district valuation role. Essentially, it's based on ownership, and one certificate of title generally equals one rating unit. There are some exceptions, but 98% of our district valuation role is built on a title being a rating unit. We used to have the role built on occupancy, but that was a lot more problematic. We've now shifted to ownership, and it's a lot more straightforward. So the valuations are based on market evidence, such as particularly sales, but also things like rentals and production numbers if it's a rural property. But mostly they're valued using market sales. And we use a sort of willing buyer, willing seller market definition. So as at 1 July 2017, what would somebody have paid in the marketplace for that house or that hotel or that farm? And the valuers use the sales evidence, analyse it, and come to a view generally about what those values would look like. The revaluation accuracy requirements, they're based on international best practice for mass appraisal, and that includes statistical tests like coefficient of dispersion and medians and that sort of thing. The thing about a mass appraisal valuation on one day every 3 years is that you can't go around and inspect every property again. You'd never get through it and the cost would be horrendous. So you do have to use techniques, mass appraisal type techniques, which typically come down to you try and categorise properties into a sort of similarity factor, and then you look at the sales of those types of properties, and if they've moved, say, 40%, then generally the non-sold properties will move in a similar fashion. That's the essence of it. And the council hold really good records, along with QV, quotable, about the sort of physical characteristics of each individual 550,000 properties. So there's good records about floor areas, views, contours, zoning, that sort of stuff. So our value definitions that we use here in New Zealand for these market values, but as at 1 July 2017, so they're already out of date, you could argue, because here we are in November. Land value is done as if there's no improvements on the site, so if it was hypothetically a vacant site, what would it sold for as at 1 July 2017? The capital value is taking account of both the land and the improvements that are on the site, and saying as at 1 July, what would that property have sold for in its entirety? And the value of improvements is, people say, really just the difference between what the capital value is and what the land value is. Now, typically in a rising market, land values move a lot faster than improvement values. And in a falling market, land values fall much faster than improvement values. So we've got a rising market here, and the thing is, what you see then is land value coming up so quickly that value of improvements is often diminished quite significantly, and that can be because the improvements that sit on there simply don't fully capitalise the land value that sits underneath it. So in valuation, it's a well-known premise that cost doesn't equal value. In a lot of cases it does, where a market's more even and tempered, then cost and value usually bear a pretty close correlation. But in a strongly rising market like we've seen in Auckland, it's quite normal, and we would expect the land values to shoot ahead a lot faster than improvements, with the result that otherwise seemingly quite good houses, the value of those improvements comes back quite significantly and can be very low. And it's not unusual to see people transporting off otherwise good houses so they can get at the site and redevelop it. So as I said at the outset there, and it's worth repeating because, you know, it does seem like a massive upheaval at times when you do a revaluation, and it is, it's a big deal, but you're legally required to do it through the Rating Valuations Act 1998. You must revalue once every 3 years, and that's because we do base our rates on property values, and over a 3-year window, the fortunes of different property owners within a district can change. And so if the dairy market, say, had dropped significantly, then it's not fair to leave those people on a value from way back that's inflated and never adjusted. So we do have to refresh the values every 3 years, and that picks up the relative pluses and minuses of various property category movements within that time period. So I've mentioned who's done the operational side of the valuation, and one good thing I thought the council did this time, and they have before as well, is to get an independent private valuer to peer review the whole basis of the valuation for the commercial and industrial properties. So these valuations are based on rents and capitalisation rates and land values per square metre. So you get someone who's totally independent from the process to have a look and say, well, what sort of rents are you using? How have you analysed the sales? What sort of capitalisation rates are you coming to? Do they align with what we're proposing to do? And, you know, that's a good safeguard, and it's a good message to put out there. So, yeah, just say, you know, it's been a complex market. I mean, the values rose dramatically between 2011 and 2014 revaluations. They've surpassed that rise again this time. So it is huge movements. Residential up 46%, You know, when you're already starting with median house prices that are right up there, that's significant change. Overlaid on that is, of course, migration into New Zealand at record numbers and unitary plans that have had to fast-track planning changes. And we're seeing a lot of new zones that we hadn't sort of seen before, much higher density. These sort of mixed-use zones now that really open up the potential of sites. You're not bound by just a commercial or just a residential use of it. And that's really pumped into the value in certain areas. Particularly in the sort of rural areas going into redevelopment propositions. So all around Auckland there's a chase for land, and when you get rural properties that now have redevelopment potential, that can lead to a big escalation in property values. And that's an example of why we do it every 3 years. We refresh the values because some parts of the ratepayer community have done relatively better than others. So the thing that underpins the right to do mass appraisal valuations the way we do for rating purposes is this thing that individual owners have a 30 working day statutory right to object to their value. So if they don't like it, they can challenge it. And that's a bit of a safeguard for this mass appraisal environment that we work in. Typically in New Zealand, the objection rate can be about 2%. It's been coming down a bit in recent years, so we like to think that's the quality of the values and the better understanding by ratepayers of what the values are. So from the councillor's perspective, what I'd be saying is councillors don't influence the values. I mean, you might argue in terms of some of the decisions that are made here help to contribute into the values, but it's up to the valuers to act independently and decide what the market level is at the time. But the councillors play a very important role in supporting the outcomes of the process. You know, would hope that you can talk sort of favourably of your understanding of how the valuation is done and an awareness of it, and that gives better confidence to the ratepayer community. But the thing is, there has been significant professional valuation input into getting to these answers, and it has been audited and quite robustly by my office that we're satisfied that it has met the kind of international benchmarks that you need to for a robust valuation. And it is a massive process. I put this slide up each time I come here because it just does sort of encapsulate the many arms and the difficulties of trying to corral a revaluation of 550,000 properties on one day, 1 July 2017. There's a lot of coordination and a lot of different bits that you've got to anticipate and control. And, you know, in my opinion, the council has managed to do that well, and I think the revaluation deserves support. So, look, that from a regulatory perspective is my take on it, and a message to the people around the table here to try and demystify what's involved, make it quite clear about what the different parts are, and happy to take any questions later. So on that note, I'll hand over to Peter, who can talk a bit more about the sort of outcomes of the revaluation and the facts and figures, the exciting stuff. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Neil. Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to touch on a few points that overlap some of the points that Neil's made. The first one is, and this is a mass appraisal valuation exercise, and even though the job is done by registered valuers, these are not registered valuations. Registered valuations require an individual property inspection and consideration. Council, as Neil said, holds very good data on properties, which is updated through various processes, consents, subdivisions, sales and ad hoc inspections. But there will be some properties where our information is not as good as it should be, and that can lead to variations. Next point, 550,000 rating units, certainly a big exercise in anybody's book. That's grown by 25,000 rating units since 2014. So back in 2014 we had 225,000 rating units. The average increase is 45% total value, and as Neil said, the sales form the basis of the valuations. There is a rigorous process that we go through. Every sale that comes in to council is coded either market or non-market. The values align with sales from the early part of 2017, but we look at sales that have happened since 2014 to make sure that, that the values sort of make sense and align with those as well, taking into account movements.
Sorry, Peter, just what does market and non-market mean in our system?
So a non-market sale would be sort of a transfer to a family trust or a sale to a company by the owners. Before we can publish, we need to get the Valuer General's approval, which we've obtained. The values went online yesterday, and the website held up well this time. We are sort of drip feeding the paper valuation notices out, staggered mail out over this week, so by the end of the week everybody should have their paper copy, or we've introduced online notification this year as well. And of course the values will be used for rating purposes from 1 July 2018. Okay, this is just a breakdown of the value movements by category types based on the OVG classifications. I think the highlights of this, and I've put the 2014 changes in the far column there. This time round the movements are a lot higher, and I think the other factor is we're seeing movements across all the category types this time round, whereas in 2014 the commercial industrial was quite far below residential. This time round it's right up there, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. Also lifestyle and rural have seen good movements since the previous revaluation. This is a geographical representation of residential value movements since 2014. The yellow is the properties have moved within between about 41 to 50%, so that's sort of your typical movements. The reds and the orange are the greater movements. So this time around, Waiheke saw a 64% increase, which was the highest movement overall. When we look back at 2014, Waiheke had a movement of around about 10%. So this is a suggestion that there is a sort of a catch-up effect in play. The other greatest movements are the southern suburbs, Mangere, Otara, Papatoe, Manurua, Papakura. We think that the pattern there is sort of the suburbs furthest out from the core of the city seeing the greatest increases. They are comparatively the lower value properties. And if we go through to the next slide, I'll put the 2014 movements there for comparison, which shows that last time we had greater movements, sort of those properties sort of surrounding the inner core. So last time we saw greater movements in Birkenhead, Glenfield, Henderson, Massey, New Lynn, Blockhouse Bay, those sorts of areas. Again, Great Barrier Island is sort of the lowest kind of mover. Suggestion that kind of remoteness is a factor there. I mean, some of the other Gulf Islands haven't fared that well as well, not as well as Waiheke. So overall, this is just a summary of the valuation kind of themes that we've seen this time round. As noted already, 45% average increase overall. I talked about the largest residential increases and what areas they're in. One of the factors that I noticed this time round is that the apartments and flats have fared quite well. At previous valuations, they tend to have lower movements than standalone housing. So again, that sort of ties in with the theme of lower value properties seeing greater movements. The next point is around commercial industrial properties. So they've seen a significant movement in comparison to what we had in 2014. The commercial industrial market is very strong at present. We're seeing some of the lowest vacancy rates for particularly industrial and office space that we've ever seen in the city. So that's the value driver. There's also a high demand for investment property and high demand for redevelopment sites. So all those factors are coming together to drive those increases. Lifestyle properties seen a big increase, and again, as Neil's touched on, a lot of those increases are driven by some of the changes to zoning, like the future urban zone, countryside living zone, where there's potential either immediate or down the track for subdivision. Neil's touched on the fact that land values have increased more than capital values, so that means improvement values have come down and properties with subdivisional potential will see sort of greater changes than average. The unitary plan, seeing the biggest effects perhaps on the fringe where we've seen rural properties being rezoned residential. Some of those values have seen increases 4 or 5 times. The market for the more central suburbs, the effects have been more sporadic, but there's still some degree of the market determining what can be done with these zones. And my final point there is that these movements that were presented this morning they're average movements, and they will vary by individual property type, classification, zoning, location. So at this point we can take some questions.
Debbie, is there anything you would like to add?
No, I think that's been covered quite well. Just that Andrew Duncan will be talking about the effects on rates going forward in your workshops towards the long-term plan.
If I could just pick up on one thing that Peter was saying there, the market sales, just to put it in perspective, close to probably 80% of all sales are classified as market sales. So very few, that would be about right, Pete, for this reval, 80% plus were market sales. So it's not a matter of taking a lot of sales out of the equation. 4 out of 5 stay in.
Yeah, yep, understand. Councillor Walker.
2 or 3 questions. The first one is around the impact of the unitary plan. It'd be fair to say that this is the first valuation post-unitary plan. Have you noticed any movement because of upzoning, so mixed urban, mixed suburban and the like?
Yeah, I think we've seen some movements, particularly where properties that were previously could take 1 unit now can take 2. So properties like in the former residential 5 zone, which was based on a density of 1 to 500. So if you had a 750 square metre site that could still only take 1 unit, now if it's gone to one of those residential mixed housing urban suburban zonings, that becomes a 2-unit site, and those properties would have seen greater increase than before.
Okay, and the other question I've got is around categories. Do you have a category for leaky homes? Because I understand that often they're worth somewhat less if there's a history around that.
Okay, we don't have a category as such, but we do identify those properties. So I mean, we've got basically a list, I guess, and those properties are looked at individually, and we take into account the factors that are affecting them, and we look at what those properties are selling for, and also the rectification costs where we can get, where we can obtain them.
Is it possible to break out the value of leaky homes across Auckland if you've identified them?
It's probably possible. I mean, I'd have to talk to the data people, yeah.
All right, thanks.
Councillor Cashmore.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'm interested in the question around accuracy of the valuations as of that date. So you talked briefly about the audit and the check. Could you have a bit more elaboration there, please? The numbers of that were percentages of properties that were actually physically tested and the accuracy determinant of that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so what we do is we look at all the sales that are deemed to be these market sales, which are 80% of the sales, and we break it down. We've got groupings of properties. We call them sales groups or roles of properties, so we can get some quite definite boundary zones around where different sub-markets are activating. And so we check each sort of sub-market group, and we're looking at all the market sales against what the proposed values are. And one of the key tests is, because you can get your sale properties quite closely aligned to the sale price, but the key test that we really look at closely is how have you treated your unsold properties as against your sold properties. And the international best practice requires that that's within a sort of 5 to 10% margin. So you couldn't be moving your sold properties 50% and your unsold properties 20%. They've got to be in a very close correlation, and that's a key one that we look at. And this is built up over international practice around statistical measures.
And the accuracy of those tests are showing us what?
Yeah, that generally there's a very good correlation between the sale properties, what they sold for, and what the proposed
Valuations are.
Yeah, yeah. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in a position to certify it, because I've got to be satisfied that, yeah, it's met an accuracy standard that is robust enough and credible.
Thank you.
In practical terms, the testing requires most of the sold properties to propose values to be within 15%, plus or minus 15%, but you can sort of have a few up to 20%. So that those are sort of the parameters we're working within.
Although it'd be fair to say that in this revaluation they'd be closer to about 5%. Yeah, they're very close. The statistical answers were really tight between proposed values and sale prices and the unsold property. So while Pete's talking about there is a margin, in this revaluation the statistical tests are very good.
So it's plus or minus 5% in this particular valuation?
Well, you're allowed wider.
Yeah, but this one...
But this one's generally, in most cases, within those kind of parameters, yeah.
Thank you.
Right, Councillor Cooper, Mike Lee, and then Councillor Darby.
Just a simple question. How much does this exercise cost? And I know we have to do it. I mean, just as...
I'd have to get back to you on that one.
Councillor Lee, Mike Lee.
Thank you all for the excellent presentation. In regard to Waiheke Island and the 64% increase in valuations over 3 years, is that influenced by is that general, or is that influenced by a few high value property sales?
We look at all the sales across Waiheke, and we've got it broken down into like 17 geographical groupings, so we'll be kind of looking at manipulating values in those groupings. If we get sales that we consider aberrations that are clearly kind of higher than the normal, we would sort of disregard those and make those non-market. So what we try and do is sort of pitch the values down the middle of the sales spread. Yeah.
So extraordinary high transactions are factored out?
Yeah.
Gosh. Presumably you're inputting this data and calibrating it over the 3 year period. Would that be right?
That's
and
correct.
So with such an extraordinary movement of 64%, has this been a steady movement, or has there been a sudden spurt or spike in value?
Look, I think most of the movement happened 2015, early 2016. Since probably mid-2016, that the market has been fairly level.
Clearly, this appears to be a robust system, and it's obviously influenced or determined even by the market, by sales. But does this also influence the market? Is this not a circular process?
Values can go down, you know, and just because the rating valuation is a certain level over the years, I've seen markets rise and fall. So just because the rating valuation's up doesn't always mean you're going to get that. And in poorer times, we've had revaluations where values could be dropping 20 or 30%.
You mentioned population growth and immigration. Does that mean that this huge increase, extraordinary increase, is not necessarily a bubble? In other words, it's demand driven. It's extraordinary as it is based on.
Yeah, well, it's a number of factors. That's probably an economist's question more than a valuer's one. It's certainly one of the contributing factors. But there's a number of other things with interest rate levels and other pieces that push into the prices.
Thank you.
Councillor Darby.
Thank you. Can you just expand a bit on the point that you've just replied to Councillor Leon, the high sales are factored out? So if you get an extraordinary, if you get a buyer who, through this period, might have factored a value into a property, paid a premium, that's the new market value, but it's not reflected in the QV value. And is that the same for low and unusually low sale prices?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the sort of definition of value: a willing seller, willing buyer. And if someone's particularly wanted a property and paid way more than what the general market level might have been, then that can be considered to be a non-market situation, because for whatever reason they're almost an over-anxious purchaser. They really want it and they paid well above. So the way you work it out is look at other sales that have occurred for similar types of property, and you get a general trend about where the value level is. And if someone comes in and it's a one-off sale and they paid 30 or 40% more, then probably that is a non-market situation. The valuer would generally try and find out from the agent or who was involved with it, what was the marketing process, why was that price paid, before they'd take it out. And then if you get 2 or 3 sales at that kind of level, then it's not a premium, it becomes the market. So it is a bit of a valuer's, they're always trying to work with the dynamics of where's the market got to for this type of property. But if you've got a good range of evidence as at leading up to 1 July at a certain level, and then there's a sale that's particularly high or particularly low, then typically that would be taken out as a non-market situation.
Okay. Look, main question really is around the objection process, it's January 16th or 19th, it's working weeks. Is that correct? We take out all the statutory days?
Yeah, the requirement is to have 30 working days for the revaluation objection period.
Yep. There seems to be an assumption when we even look at our own collateral that's on our website that the person that can object has to be the property owner. But am I correct to say, and this has been asked of me in the last 24 hours, that another party, as long as they are a ratepayer, they may not own the property, but if they are an Auckland ratepayer, they can object to another property owner's valuation. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So does that apply to lessees where they have a lease which determines that they pay rates, and would it not apply to an individual or company or entity, whatever, that is paying rent, but it's not clear on the rent agreement that they're paying rates?
If they're a registered lease, they are the ratepayer, and then they do get a valuation notice and they can object. If they're not a registered lease, and that's generally less than 10 years, they've got no right to object as a lessee, but if they were a ratepayer of another property in Auckland Council, they could object.
They can do it that way. Okay, thank you. It's good to have that clear. But on just feedback, on our website, it's not really clear as to who can and cannot object.
Okay. Debbie's noting that. Councillor Walker, John, sorry.
Yeah, I was just looking on our website for Newmarket. Newmarket doesn't exist on the valuation. Is it? I'm not doing right?
Sorry, the Newmarket's not included on...
No, I can't find anything with Newmarket.
Okay, I'll have to have a look at that and come back to you.
Don't mind.
Yeah. Okay.
It's only a small place anyway.
Maybe we haven't got them on our rating basis either, John.
Just found some extra money for us.
You've lost your property, John.
But the other one,
Councillor Philippine.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned with Councillor Lee's question, you mentioned groupings within the local board. So I've tried looking at it when we first received it. So the information I'm assuming is there, for example, Mangere Bridge, in the last valuation shot up. I think it was 52% in the last valuation. Then you've had Mangere East. So is that the groupings you're referring to as a specific areas within the local board area? Is that the detail that you're saying is going to be there?
The valuers drive the valuations by their own grouping, which Neil's referred to as role areas.
Yep.
So we have these geographic groupings called valuation role areas. So we would analyse all the sales in that geographical grouping and apply our kind of indexing factors based on those sales in that grouping.
Okay, so with the local board, which has Mangere Central, Mangere Bridge, so you're saying that the valuer would just look at the local board as an entity?
No, we would look at the sort of the sub-market groupings at a final level, yeah.
Okay.
So that those figures that we presented are kind of averages for the local board.
Yep, for that local board, eh?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, again, Mangere Otahu 55, o Tarapapa Toitoi 62, which is an increase from 2014. So it'll be interesting when I knuckle down to the actual areas as to where the increase has been. Thank you, Chair.
Mayor Goff, I noticed his property was listed quite widely somewhere.
It was listed and inaccurately. Message to the Herald: get your facts right, please. A couple of issues. This is done from July 2014 to July 2017. Do I take it that these valuations capture 2.5 years of rapidly rising prices and probably half a year of static? So is that what it basically represents?
Yeah, that would be correct. I mean, it is a snapshot as at 1 July 2017, so that's where the market is on that particular day.
How does that average residential increase, I've seen it 45 and somebody said 46, but somewhere thereabouts, how does that compare with other provincial and metropolitan centres? This valuation is done right across the country at the same time?
No, not at the same time.
No, we've got 67 councils, I think, across New Zealand, and roughly a third of them revalue each year. Okay. So we have about 23 going through each year, as long as you do it once every 3 years. So of those third that have been revalued at the same time, how does our residential value increases, how do they compare with other provincial and metro centres? Market's been quite strong across a lot of New Zealand, and those kind of numbers aren't too dissimilar to good markets around the rest of New Zealand. Queenstown, Waikato district, those have revalued this year as well, and they're showing strong lifts similar to the Auckland profile. Okay, great. The difference with Auckland is it had the big rise between 2011 and 2014. So it's a rise on top of a rise. That's right, whereas a lot of those other districts didn't have such pronounced rises 2011 to 2014.
I don't know whether this is within your area of expertise, but I was watching the news last night and people were expressing concern that the rising in your rating valuation would translate to a big increase in rents. Is it your experience that rents charged by landlords simply reflect market conditions and what the market will pay, or does it reflect the rating valuation? Have you got any basis for being able to determine that?
Probably nothing factual, but just a general sense that just because costs rise doesn't mean rents will automatically follow.
Yeah.
Rents are on a supply and demand situation.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, I'd generally subscribe to that view.
So the idea that, you know, we all notice that in South Auckland the values have partly caught up with the increase that had happened in other areas 3 years previously. The sense that rents will suddenly shoot through the roof is more probably scaremongering than reflection of reality.
Could well be.
Could well be.
Yeah. On the question of objections, how many objections do you normally get, and what are they based on? Why do people object to their rateable value? Do they think it's too low or too high, or is it a combination and a mixture of all of those things?
In 2011, we got 11,000 objections, and 2014 we got 10,000 objections, so it's roughly about 2.3%. In 2011, we had more objectors wanting increases than decreases. That reversed in 2014. People were wanting them down.
Yeah.
Probably relating the rates effect. Yeah, there's no real patterns. Some people want them up because they think it might help with marketing their properties, or might help them get a bigger loan. And people that want them down, obviously, looking at the rates effects.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? You know, knowing that this is a public meeting because it's being sent out. When are we? Everybody's saying, what will this do to our rates? I mean, people first of all think, gee, look how much wealthier I am, and then secondly, wow, this is going to mean an increase in rates. Thank you, Debbie, for your efforts this morning on Morning Report, which I thought were very good. Yeah, that deserves a round of applause from everybody. But there is still a sense out there, two things really, despite the communications efforts, that if your rates have got, if your value's gone up by 45%, your rates will too, and patently that's untrue. But they want to know what their rates will go up by, and we won't know that until we've gone through the exercise of the 10-year budget by next year. But if you were to, say, take a hypothetical, rates will increase by 2.5%, if that happens, your rates will be such and such. When will that sort of information be available to the public?
I'm not sure when it will be available to the public, but Andrew Duncan's team will be working through that with you councillors in the next few months.
Yeah, because I think it would be useful to have that sort of hypothetical answer out there at least, rather than simply saying, hey, we don't know what your rates will be, which we don't until we know what we're going to strike the rate at. But just to provide some reassurance to people that this doesn't mean you know, thousands of dollars extra on their rates, other than in one or two exceptional cases. The last question I've got was really the one of my colleagues asked, I think, before. I noticed, Neil, you said this used to be done by the Valuation Department. It was transferred to local government, and I presume the costs of doing it were transferred to local government?
For the operational side, that's right, yes.
Yeah, so it would be useful for us to know just what the, you know, this is a big exercise, over 500,000 properties. If we can find out what this exercise basically costs, compliments of it being transferred to us as a responsibility, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Councillor Walker, Wayne Walker with a very short question.
Just got a quick question just on the value of the commercial and industrial property. Do you have the amount of that dollar value of commercial and industrial property, and could we have that information relative to the residential property and the lifestyle property and the like, And my reason for asking that, Mr. Chair, is my concern that goes to rating is if we've had a significant movement in the amount of the commercial and industrial property, it follows that that sector should be paying a larger proportion of the council's expenses, rather than the present circumstance where we just have a structural percentage. So I just want to put that on the table. So if we could have that, that would be useful.
Yep, will get circulated to people. So. All right, well, I'm happy to move this report, receive the presentation, seconded by Councillor Simpson, and we're thanking Neil and Peter and Debbie, and once again, Debbie, well done this morning. So.
Yeah, well done.
Okay. So, Councillor Hills.
Just a quick comment. Just thanking you for your work, and especially Debbie this morning. There has been in the last couple of days some extremely incorrect information coming around, but unfortunately through some media agencies too. So we're working that out. But I think your succinct, if everyone could listen to your succinct answers after they allowed someone else to give some completely incorrect information to people straight before you, and people will get quite upset by the thought of, you know, thousands of extra dollars of rate. So it was great to hear your answers on that. But I think just if we can all try and correct that information out there, because it happens every 3 years and everyone gets confused. But I think the information's been really well put out. So thank you.
Yes, it's interesting to see that information is often misleading from the same people. Anyway, thank you very much.